Hey folks, thanks for joining me here on the Classic English Literature Podcast. We are back and on time, yes. For those listeners who know what's going on, we avoided a strike at the last hour, and so I am able to devote my time once more to the sterling work done here on the Classic English Literature Podcast, where rhyme gets its reason. And we're actually back to some rhyme this time. See what I did there? It's been a couple of months since we got tucked into some really chewy poetry, so it feels good to get back to it. The playwright and critic John Dennis said of today's writer that he was, quote, a whole species of poets in one, because today's featured guest, Samuel Butler, could deftly blend satire, elegy, burlesque, and lyric to a subtle and various effect. Samuel Butler was well known and quite well regarded in his own day, which is the Caroline Restoration, 1670s, but he has faded from the consciousness of modern readers. Now, he still clung white-knuckled to his little corner of the canon in the early 20th century, but by the 1970s was reduced to a mere excerpt in the Oxford Anthology of English Literature, and today, alas, there is a Butler-shaped hole in the Norton anthologies that dominate much undergraduate literary study. I can sort of see why. His great work, the mock epic poem Hudibras, is not the kind of literature fashionable in the academy anymore. It really appeals to the concerns of antiquated critical schools like New Criticism and the Old Historicism. Its pleasure relies upon a knowledge of 17th century English history, the recognition of allusions to Renaissance literature, and a sensitivity to language that no longer really occupy the central position in literary studies that they once did. Now, yeah, I know. I've produced now nearly 100 episodes relying on those very assumptions, but my audience is an erudite and curious community. The fact that Butler's poem is at its very core an extended allusion to Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen, which no one reads anymore, means that Butler was always going to get riffed. Now, I do have my personal preferences. I also understand that needs and interests change and that some authors must be dropped so that others may be covered. But I'm here as a podcasting necromancer to raise the literary corpse of Mr. Samuel Butler from the dead, at least for a half hour or so. Butler was born in 1613 in Worcestershire, England, to a fairly modest farming family. Well educated, probably at the local grammar school, and later on worked in various roles, including as a clerk and tutor for the Countess of Kent, the antiquarian John Selden, and Lord Carbery. Can you guess which side of the Civil War Butler was on? If you said the Royalists, you're right. But don't get a big head about it. There are creatures lying on their backs at the bottom of ponds who would have sorted that out. But Butler's claim to literary fame wouldn't arrive until his middle age, and when it did, it was sharp, irreverent, and pointed straight at the pious hypocrisy of his age. By the time Charles II returned to the throne in 1660, ushering in that restoration of the monarchy, Butler's satirical talents found a ready audience. He published the nearly 10,000 lines of Hudibras between 1663 and 1678. You can think of it as Don Quixote doing Puritan cosplay, a brilliant lampoon of the Puritans' self-importance, legalism, and religious zeal. The poem was a smash. Went through 9 editions, actually, and it earned Butler a royal pension, and His Majesty was quite fond of quoting it. Well, that's a blurb. Well, you know what time it is, right? Bring on the quick and dirty. Wait, you know what? Butler gives us one. Well, here's the argument from the first canto. Quote, Sir Hudibras, his passing worth, the manner how he sallied forth, his arms and equipage are shown, his horse's virtues and his own, the adventure of the bear and fiddle is sung, but breaks off in the middle. There's no grand plot in Hudibras. It's episodic, like a sitcom or a picaresque tale. The real purpose is to skewer the Puritans, who, in Butler's view, cloaked narrow-mindedness and power hunger in the robes of piety and moral reform. Our hero, if you want to call him that, is Sir Hudibras, a knight who fancies himself a learned, righteous defender of Puritan values. He's pompous, self-important, and utterly incompetent. His loyal sidekick, Ralpho, is a squire with equally absurd delusions of philosophical and theological wisdom. Together, they strike out to uphold the moral order, or, rather, butting their noses into other people's lives in the name of virtue. Folks who, according to Butler, quote, compound for sins they are inclined to by damning those they have no mind to. In part 1, the dynamic duo attack a group of people innocently celebrating a traditional festival because they see it as sinful. They're soon captured and imprisoned by a mob they tried to police, and then they're released, though Sir Hudibras lies to Ralpho and pretends it was due to divine intervention. Part 2, Hudibras seeks to court a wealthy widow, purely for her money, of course. But his over-the-top moralizing and hypocrisy blow up the plan. The widow mocks him and puts him through a humiliating test of love, which, of course, he fails miserably. In the third part, he consults a cunning man, kind of astrologer charlatan, for advice, then goes on various misadventures that further expose his foolishness, his arrogance, and a complete lack of self-awareness. As I hinted earlier, Butler takes the name of his protagonist from Book 2 of Spenser's Faerie Queene, in which a knight of that name is mocked for being more brawn than brain. Quote, Yet not so good of deeds as great of name, which he by many rash adventures wan, since errant arms to sow he first began, more huge in strength than wise in works he was, and reason with foolhardys overran. Now, Spenser may have picked up the name Hudibras from the histories of Raphael Holinshed or Geoffrey of Monmouth. We've talked about those chaps before. At any rate, many scholars reckon that Butler's character is based on a real guy, one Sir Samuel Luke, one of Cromwell's most inflexibly Presbyterian officers. He later became the MP for Bedford, a position to which, in one of literature's fun small world moments, John Bunyan's future congregation elected him. But even more than simply nicking the name of a minor presence from Spenser's magnificent octopus, even a cursory reading of Butler's poem reveals its great debt, or satirical contrast maybe, to England's great Renaissance epic. There was an accepted rule for the mighty heroic poem, and that was that it had to include an allegorical meaning. And Butler obliges with some instances of what we call the roman à clef. Footnote: a roman à clef is a fictional tale portraying real people under invented names. End footnote. So as I said, Hudibras is the poetic embodiment of Samuel Luke, But while, for instance, in Spenser's poem, each of his knights is an allegorical depiction of a particular virtue, for instance, Sir Guyon in Book 2 stands for temperance, Butler makes his characters the manifestations of particular vices, especially hypocrisy and stupidity, or what he calls nonsense. Another great font of inspiration for Butler are the satires of Ben Jonson, whose plays The Alchemist and Volpone we covered in episode 68, I believe. Jonson made his bones exposing the vices of his age, right? Greed, vanity, false piety, through grotesque and deluded characters. If you remember, in Volpone, we get a con man pretending to be on his deathbed so he can fleece his would-be heirs. In The Alchemist, we watch a trio of charlatans swindle gullible Londoners with fake potions and mystical babble. Jonson's characters aren't realistic. Remember, they're humors, defined by a single dominant trait: avarice, ambition, gullibility, that sort of thing. Butler takes the same satirical scalpel and applies it to the Puritans. He even mimics Jonson's tendency to use, grotesque physical or verbal tics to highlight the ridiculousness of his characters. Sir Hudibras, much like Jonson's con artists and fools, is a man convinced of his own righteousness, yet blind to his own absurdity. He talks in learned language, but his logic is illogical. His morality is as hollow as a dead tree, and like Jonson's characters, he's constantly caught in the gap between who he thinks he is and what he really is, a hypocrite in holy clothing. Hudibras isn't a psychologically deep character. He's a type, a satire of the self-important Puritan justice of the piece, puffed up with bad Latin and worse reasoning. For both Jonson and Butler, the world is a kind of, a moral carnival. Chaotic, theatrical, and it's just crawling with frauds. There's no grand redemption arc. The point is to expose the absurdity and let the audience laugh, or probably wince, at the spectacle. And while Jonson does this on stage with bustling Londoners, Butler does it in verse with Cromwellian moralizers. So, what Butler serves up, really, is Johnsonian ridicule in Spenserian costume. It is parody, put simply. The poem opens with the précis quoted above, and then sets our story during the Civil Wars and the Commonwealth. Quote, "When civil fury first grew high, and men fell out they knew not why, when hard words, jealousies, and fears set folks together by the ears, and made them fight like mad or drunk for Dame Religion as for punk. And then we're introduced to our gallant knight. A wight he was, whose very sight would entitle him mirror of knighthood, that never bent his stubborn knee to anything but chivalry." It's very Spenserian, that. Well, actually, it's very Chaucerian. It sounds like it describes the knight from the Canterbury Tales. Perspicacious listeners will recall from episode 39 that Spenser consciously adopted an archaic idiom as a shout-out to his medieval mentor. There's a nice little moment when the reader is introduced to Ralph in Hudibras, or Ralpho. Sounds more romantic and continental, don't you know? And Ralpho is Hudibras's, no doubt, illiterate squire. Butler writes, "A squire he had, whose name was Ralph, that in the adventure went his half." Half. Well, okay, there's a bit more going on here than meets the eye. I brought up this little couplet because of the slant rhyme of Ralph and half. Now, to read it as a perfect rhyme, we would have to pronounce the L in half. We'd have to say half. And I think Butler wants us to here, because it sounds Spenserian or Chaucerian. It rings of Middle English and the days of yore. I don't think we're supposed to pronounce the squire's name Rafe in this line, because then the rhyme is not simply slanted, it's downright cockeyed. Butler goes on to note in a meta moment that, quote, though writers for more stately tone do call him Ralpho, 'tis all one, and when we can with metre safe we'll call him so, if not plain Ralph or Rafe. For rhyme the rudder is of verses, with which like ships they steer their courses. Now I like this because there's that little bit of a poke in the eye to pedantic versifiers. Butler says, quote, whatever, I'll call him anything you want so long as it fits my meter. Probably some comment on form over content here, on what one is over against what one is known as, here that we could unpack if we felt like it. Not sure I do. I think that you get the point. While he seems to plead faithfulness to his line, he's careless about his characters. Well, maybe not careless. Put a pin in that for the nonce. I may come back to it. But that Ralph Half thing is interesting too, because Ralph is by no means the equal of mighty Hudibras. He's half the man his master is. We've already been treated to a catalog of the knight's gifts. He's a polyglot, fluent in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. This latter to an extent that, quote, some think him circumcised. I didn't realize that had an effect. He's a profound logician and sophist who could, quote, prove a buzzard is no fowl and that a lord may be an owl. His special gift, though, is rhetoric. Quote, for rhetoric he could not ope his mouth, but out there flew a trope, and when he happened to break off in the middle of his speech or cough, had hard words ready to show why and tell what rules he did it by. He surpasses Tycho Brahe in his knowledge of mathematics, and is a shrewd philosopher, a second Aquinas or another Duns Scotus. Those are Catholic philosophers, by the by. Hardly Presbyterian. Ralph, or Ralpho, or Rafe, knows none of these civilizing disciplines. He is, however, familiar with the occult, though he has rejected that knowledge, let me be clear, in favor of radical Protestantism. Quote, for mystic learning, wondrous able in magic talisman and cabal, whose primitive tradition reaches as far as Adam's first green breeches. If you have an irony deficiency, you might think our heroes rather awesome. But you'd have to be absolutely insensate not to feel that something's off. I mean, even if you didn't know you were going to read a satire and you weren't sure of what the contrast between dame religion and punk was, the latter is slang for a prostitute, if you'd like to be sure. I think the rhythm and the rhyme of Hudibras lets you know that the poem's tongue is firmly in its cheek. Butler writes in rhyming octosyllabic couplets. Iambic, yes, but not the heroic and stately pentameter of Spenser, Marlowe, Shakespeare, and Milton. Oh, no. This is truncated. It hurtles along with gusto. The poet John Dryden, and we'll meet him in a few episodes, disliked Hudibras because of the indecorousness of its versification. It's bawdy, right? So really fitting for a poem that shortly reveals itself as burlesque. And that's part of Butler's overall project, really. Critic Ian Jack points out that, quote, throughout Hudibras, great emphasis is laid on the difference between profession and performance, outer seeming and inner reality. It would hardly be an exaggeration to say that in this poem, every species of human folly and crime is represented as a species of hypocrisy. When Ralph asks his master, why didst thou choose that cursed sin hypocrisy to set up in? Hudibras replies, because it is the thrivingest calling, the only saint's bell that rings all in. Jack further points out that Butler's purpose in Hudibras is, quote, to kill any sympathy which the reader may feel for the subject of his satire. I must agree, there's a venom in this work that fellow satirists Chaucer and even Jonson failed to produce. Quite unlike Butler's other great model, Cervantes' 1605 blockbuster, the above-mentioned Don Quixote, which many cite, by the way, as the first and maybe even the greatest novel. Butler does many of the same things that Cervantes references: the episodic plot featuring a deluded knight and his squire, the use of consciously archaic language, the deployment of irony and puns and burlesque. But while we have a bit of fun at old Quixote's expense, we never really get the sense that we should disdain him. Butler is far more poisonous in his satire than is his great Spanish forebear. Broadly speaking, we've traditionally seen satire as belonging to two different groups. The first, called Horatian, and it's named for the Roman poet Horace, it's of a gentle, witty type, not really indignant, just bemused, and kind of hoping that things will eventually improve. Chaucer writes mostly, I think, in this mode, and so does Jonson, well, most of the time, anyway, I guess. But Butler is pointing in another direction. The second satirical type, Juvenalian, again from a Roman author, is darker, heavier, much more acerbic and contemptuous. Hudibras is, I think, more of this type. It's more Juvenalian. There's that rollicking playfulness to the verse and some rather silly jokes, but we are clearly meant to loathe the protagonists. Their hypocrisy leads to death and destruction. Of Hudibras's religion, Butler says, quote, he was of that stubborn crew of errant saints whom all men grant to be the true church militant, such as do build their faith upon the holy text of pike and gun, decide all controversies by infallible artillery, and prove their doctrine orthodox by apostolic blows and knocks, call fire and sword and desolation a godly thorough reformation, which always must be carried on, and still be doing, never done. Butler goes on to list puritanical inconsistencies, not only promulgating the gospel with violence, but also on subjects like free will and predestination, humility and obedience. The falseness of Hudibras's vaunted knowledge perfectly fits with the recalcitrant ignorance of radical Presbyterianism. I think it's good to have had episodes on Bunyan and Butler, back to back. That's a lot of B's, honey. John Bunyan's self-righteous rigidity is just begging for a skewering, and Butler is happy to oblige. And though Hudibras no longer enjoys a place on many bookshelves, it has had some lasting impact. On the more trivial end of the spectrum, many lines have worked their way into modern idiomatic expressions. For instance, look a gift horse in the mouth, or devil take the hindmost, or spare the rod and spoil the child. Maybe more importantly, though, it has given us a lens through which we can critique not only specifically Puritanism, but any movement whose putative moralism masks political tyranny and personal hypocrisy. I know that's probably a very foreign concept to people living in the world today. How can we have leaders, governments, movements who plead morality and yet behave with tyranny and hypocrisy? You'll just have to take my word for it. We've had satirists in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, who poked the church and state with a stick, but always with a bit of a wink and a nod. Butler is a harder man, and he makes possible, maybe, the hardest of English satirists, Dr. Swift. But he is for another episode. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. I'm glad I could be back on time. Please do all the nice things that I ask you. Post positive reviews, tell all your friends, send me some money. I think next time, we'll do a bit of snooping in people's diaries. That'll be a hoot. Talk to you soon.